I'm Diksha Basu, and this is The Story Behind the Story.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Tim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Diksha Basu.
Well, happy spring, everybody, and welcome to the Author Stories Podcast. If you go to hankgarner.com, we've got a new site design I think you're going to like. It's easier to dig through all the archives of the show. And as always, there's a little search box on the right-hand side and a box where you can sort them in a long list, and you can find an author interview that you like. Also, subscribe to the show. There are buttons over there in the right-hand sidebar as well. If you would like to support the show, there is a link in the right-hand sidebar where you can donate to the show. If you'd like to drop something in the Author Stories tip jar, there's also a link in the top sidebar where if you would like to advertise your product or service in the show, you can do that as well. Thank you so much for listening, and as always, please click on the Amazon links in the show notes and support the authors that come on, and we do appreciate it. After our great author interview today, stay tuned at the end of the show for an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Hey authors, you need an editor in your life. And not just an editor, but an editor that understands you and gets what you're trying to accomplish. That's why you need to visit my good friend Scott Woodley at marlomoss.net and let him take a look at your work. He'll give you a free sample edit. Scott can help you be the best writer you can be. Visit him at marlomoss.net. Inspired sentences and polished paragraphs for print-worthy books at competitive rates and always on time. Offering a full range of editorial and ghostwriting services to self-published and traditionally published authors. Turn your ideas into words and see your dreams become books. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Diksha Basu on the show with me today. She has a new book called The Windfall that has been out for a little while. It's an amazingly funny book. I think you guys are really going to love it. And as you're listening to this today, it's out in paperback for the first time today. So we want to encourage everyone to go pick up a copy. Welcome to the show, Diksha.
Thank you for having me.
I'm excited to have you on the show. Before we get into the interview, though, we begin each show with the same question. And that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh, that's a good question. My answer for specifically as a writer might be more recent than many writers because I came into it quite late. So I'm going to start first with the storyteller aspect of your question, because my original aspiration had been to be an actress. And that's what I set out to do when I was in my early 20s, also quite late. You know, many people find their creative goals at a younger age, but I started off studying economics and math and going down that route, and then discovered right after I finished my undergraduate degree in those subjects that I wanted to tell stories via acting. And so I started performing on stage. I was doing a lot of theater in New York, and I started doing some films. And then I made the move to Bombay in 2007 to try my hand at the industry there, a little bit of Bollywood, a little bit of the independent films. And I can also tell you that that is when my dreams of being a storyteller through acting were killed. It's a very messy industry. It's not a great industry, especially for women. So I did do some work there. I did a few films. I did a lot of theater, but then I just sort of started to get frustrated with the lack of power that I had in the process of storytelling by being in an industry that wasn't the actor's medium. It's a director's medium. It's an editor's medium. It's not necessarily the actor's medium. And I'm speaking primarily about the Indian film industry right now. And so I started writing. And that's when I feel I stayed true to the idea of storytelling, but the writing came later on. I'd say this was about 2008 2010, when I started making the shift from acting to writing, and a lot of that. So a lot of my writing is actually very dialogue heavy, you'll notice, and I think that's because I have a ear for dialogue.
Well, and that's precisely why I ask that question the way I do, is because for so many of us, and I do not think you're alone in this at all, is that I think storytellers are born that way. There's a gene, and there's probably actually not a gene, but we're talking metaphor because we're writers.
Right.
There's a gene there that storytellers have, and there's a need to try to convey stories to people. And sometimes that's through writing, the physical act of writing a book. Sometimes it's through acting. Sometimes it's through, verbal communication. There's so many different ways. And then for a lot of those people later on in life, we start working on the craft of writing, which is a natural progression of the storytelling gene, I think. So you're not alone at all. And there have been lots of people that have been on the show that are kind of frustrated actors, or maybe screenwriters, or playwrights and or directors, and then they come to writing because they realize that they can more fully express that thing that they've been trying to express, because you have full control of the whole experience when you write fiction.
You definitely do have much more power. It's much more satisfying.
Yeah. So what was it originally that drove you to want to get into acting?
The desire to live multiple lives in this one life. I have a great death anxiety, and I've always had it. And it was, a lot of it stemmed from, it was slowing down my decision making, this death anxiety, because every decision took on the burden of mortality, which is really putting a lot on deciding what to make for dinner. But it really was slowing me down, and acting allowed me in those temporary bursts to be other people whose mortality didn't affect my mortality, who could be immortal in many ways, and who were short-lived, who were there just for the duration of that play or of that film or of that television show. And so it let me live more lives, and therefore sort of trick myself into feeling immortal in a way, of not being as scared of death. And, not that I fixed my death anxiety in any way. It continues side by side while I do this, but it gives me moments of respite, both acting and writing, to be able to embody other characters and other lives.
Acting and writing and the whole gamut there allow us to kind of live vicariously through other characters. But it sounds like you really wanted to have a sense of security, and normalcy may not be a good word, but a sense of feeling secure by living through someone else's life.
Yes, and I also find that I travel a lot. I've sort of led a very nomadic life, and I continue to do so now, even with the family. And that's another way of tapping into this ability to, like you said, feel secure by, in some ways, giving up all security, by stepping away from every regular day-to-day attachment and life and routine. That makes you feel somehow more secure. You're right. It's very contradictory in a way.
It is,
but
I
that
love
is how it works.
You said that you moved to Bombay, and where did you grow up?
So I was born in New Delhi, India.
Okay.
I lived there through my early childhood, but my parents, who are both academics and also restless like me and love traveling, they moved us around quite freely. So we spent a lot of time all over the world, really, and then moved to America in the mid-90s. And I had a large part of my upbringing here as well. But while continuing to travel and spending summers and winters and about 4 months of the year elsewhere, so primarily in India, also in the US, is sort of where I grew up, with one foot in both, while also spending large periods of time in other countries. And then I ended up studying, my undergraduate degree was in upstate New York at Cornell. And then after that, I moved to New York City, which is when I started acting. And then I made the move to Bombay.
Gotcha. That's a circuitous route, and
Very much so.
I love that so much because those are the stories that that make people, and I like to hear about people's experience with where they grew up and the kind of experiences that made them who they are, because a lot of times in the writing, the place and the setting seems to take on a characteristic of all of its own in the book. How do you feel like growing up, in India and in America, kind of that split home, if you will? How do you think that affects the way you tell stories?
Gosh, in every way. Contemporary India is such a fascinating muse. It's changing so rapidly and in such bizarre ways that it provides endless fodder for writing. But I think what really helped me identify what I wanted to write about was the fact that I was spending large chunks of time away from there. So every time I left India, when I came back, say 5 or 6 months later, especially in the late 90s when the Indian economy had just opened up, you really saw visible changes. And that continues now, with sort of small local coffee shops suddenly become Starbucks, and malls came up in the late 90s in India. The concept of malls were new, and how that changed the way the cities functioned, and the roads transformed in front of my eyes. But they're changes that I don't think would have affected me as much if I saw them day to day. The same way you don't necessarily see your child growing up, but if you spend a week away, you go back and you see this drastic change. That's how India felt to me. Every time I came back, I saw such obvious changes that my friends who were there every day maybe weren't witnessing as actively. And that's when it really helped me to have this back and forth between the two countries. And of course, it informed me as well, because I was navigating the social world in two different countries, two very different countries. So I had a set of friends in America and I had a set of friends in India. And I think maybe that's when my acting started, because I would adapt myself according to which country I was in. And that told me a lot about both myself and the two countries, how I related to them and how I morphed into the fully Indian version of myself while in Delhi, and then the fully American version of myself while in America, and what I brought from those two places into the other one.
Not only witnessing the physical changes of the place and the economic changes, but I grew up in a small town, and then when my wife and I got married, we moved away, we traveled, we lived in some different states and cities, and then we wound up coming back to that same small town. And you not only do you notice the way the streets are laid out differently, and you have a certain appreciation for the physical parts of it, but the culture, I think you have a different appreciation for when you leave and come back. After you've experienced the ways other people live or the way other people do things, and then you come back and there's a different cultural appreciation. Do you feel like that is a big part of your writing as well?
Absolutely. And coming back is so different from entering anew, isn't it? Like you said, when you come back, you already have a point of reference, and you have to reconfigure that point of reference for yourself. And that can have quite a impact on you, because you assume that the place you leave behind maybe won't change. It feels a bit like a betrayal when you come back and you don't quite know it. It's like when you come back to a home you used to live in, and everything sort of feels just a little bit smaller. And it's disorienting, and you have to reconfigure how you fit into it and what your new relationship is with it. I sound like I'm going down a Holden Caulfield road here, so I'll stop.
No, that's great. So what was that decision point for you to start writing?
Like all my decisions have been very unthought through and very quick decisions that fortunately I don't overthink. And I have to say, again, I shouldn't generalize about other writers, but I never have had this feeling of this is it, this is the only thing I can do, I've found my calling. I haven't had that. It is that writing gives me immense pleasure. But if it was taken away from me, I would still survive. But it became this thing of right now, putting things down on the page gives me immense pleasure. And especially when I started, it was with no regard to an audience, because obviously in the beginning you don't have an audience. I was writing for myself. but it gave me just satisfaction and it made me laugh. And that's why I started doing it.
So tell me the idea behind the Windfall. It's this kind of cultural satire. I think is maybe a good way to talk about it. It's a look at society and kind of societal climbers. Where did the idea for this come from?
Again, growing up in Delhi in the 90s with this huge explosion of wealth that I mentioned earlier, it was hard not to see it, especially going back and forth, how the city changed, how the cars on the roads changed, and how, like you said, that affected the society that I was living in. And so I had been toying with this idea of what it means for a family to suddenly come into a lot of wealth. I think there's a lot written about families that fall from wealth. But I was really toying with this idea of what it means to suddenly come into wealth and how you navigate the different social waters of the new world that money opens up within the same city. So in these same cities, especially these big urban metropolises that we have growing around the world now, Hong Kong, Singapore, Delhi, Bombay, you see them a lot in Asia, these sort of mega cities that are booming with the income disparity that comes within them. It's just multiple different worlds all clumped together inside these towns, inside these cities, and they're living side by side. And it's so fascinating that you can have a completely different experience in the same city based on the amount of wealth that you have access to. And Delhi, that was so obvious in the late 90s. It was so clear on the roads, in the markets, everywhere. It was just it was hard not to write about that. I can't imagine what else my first book would have been about.
We talk a lot about differences in genres, and some writers like the window dressing of different genres. Maybe it's fantasy, maybe it's science fiction, maybe it's horror, maybe it's literary fiction, maybe it's satire. But at the heart of all of those things are human stories. We read books because we want to connect with other people. We want to see maybe ourselves reflected through other people. We want to see our neighbors reflected. We want to understand, how we as people kind of navigate this world. And not only genre allows us to do that, but setting allows us to do that as well. And whereas, I grew up a very typical American upbringing, when I read your book, I get a window into how people across the world from me deal with the same exact things that I deal with. And we all know people like the characters in this book. We all know situations like this. And we get to see it played out in a different way because this is a different country and a different culture. But at the heart of it, we all wrestle with the same things, don't we?
Absolutely. And in a way, that's why reality television is doing as well as it's doing right now, because we want to see how other people are dealing with things. And, one of the titles I originally wanted for the book was Keeping Up with the Chopras, but you can't do that because the Kardashians basically own that concept now. And so,
but I love that title. That would have been amazing.
But one of the facets, I don't watch a lot of reality television, but when I do, it holds a sort of similar intrigue for me as fiction does, because like you said, these are people, the Kardashians are the Real Housewives of New York. Their lives have nothing to do with mine, but in many ways,
and probably very little to do with reality.
Probably, but we're still watching human interactions play out, and it's the same thing with film and with television, and so much excellent television right now. Those are the human stories, and I think reality shows are our way of peeking into other lives the same way fiction lets us. And so it is interesting. I think there's a lot these days that allows you to have peeks into your neighbor's windows. And it's literally, I feel, the reason I like big cities is you can literally peek into your neighbor's window. And I love that. I love watching what my neighbors are doing. I shouldn't confess to this, but I shouldn't certainly admit to where I live. But I love looking into neighbors' windows. I love looking at what someone else is reading or just their day-to-day lives and how they're having dinner and the small details that fill their lives.
This is a comedy of manners. What do you mean by that?
You'll have to ask my publishers that. I don't even know.
So I think that it's because we're looking at the way people behave and how society dictates, that our place and then how we behave with one another. Was that a conscious effort in the writing?
Absolutely. And one of the things I like to play with a lot in my writing is how two people misinterpret the exact same situation. That's something that really fascinates me. And so I do a lot of moving close third person perspectives in my writing because I feel a lot of intrigue and a lot of interest comes when you see two people standing and looking at the exact same object but processing it in a completely different way, or having the same conversation but at complete cross purposes. That's what really interests me the most. And I think there's always room for comedy there. And perhaps the term can also allude to that. There's a potential there for so much comedy in confusion and misrepresentation and cross-purpose conversations. And I like to play with that a lot as well.
Did you know when you began this that it was going to be as funny as it is? Was that your intention to have a lighthearted kind of poke at at society? And
that's always my intention in every interaction, everything I do. My intention is to be able to laugh at most things or laugh with most things. But this started actually as a collection of short stories. And they were interconnected short stories, sort of to do primarily with the main couple, which is, like we mentioned, the couple that comes into the large sum of money. So it was sort of loosely following them, but through more episodic stories as opposed to a full novel. And so within each story, I was looking for humor while exploring bigger things, while exploring how India is changing, the intergenerational tensions that this change is providing, the gender disparities that India and the whole world struggles with, the actual implications of religion trickling into government and policy, a lot of things I wanted to deal with without being, for lack of a better word, boring about it. A lot of writing that tries to make a point ends up being very earnest. So my goal was always to be able to laugh, but also looking at some of the heavier things that a country as complicated as India is currently going through.
Well, and you can more easily talk about serious things, things that we need to talk about, if you can get people to laugh about it. The old adage, a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. And not that you're necessarily trying to push a point or agenda or anything like that. So don't get me wrong. But just the fact that we can talk about important things, if we laugh a little bit about it and we see the humor in other people and by contrast, see the humor in our own selves, because we see that we are absurd a lot of times.
Gosh, I hope every reader brings to this what you are, Hank.
That's I love it. So what was you said this was a collection of short stories to begin with. Was there a particular character that came to you first, and how did this transform from the collection of short stories into the novel that it is now?
Yes, so my it's hard to say main character, but certainly the one who has the most page space is probably Mr. Jha, who's a 50-something, middle-aged, middle-class Indian man. And somehow that was the voice that came to me. That was the voice I enjoyed writing the most. So it certainly wasn't a question of just writing what you know, because I'm not a middle-aged man. And so I really enjoyed writing him first and foremost. And then all the characters that filled his world came up around him. But yes, it was a collection of short stories that I started working on during my MFA at Columbia. And it's just easier in the MFA setting to workshop short stories as opposed to novel excerpts, because your workshop classmates change every semester, your professors change every semester. So instead of trying to give a large amount of context, it was easier and more fun for me to write contained 5,000-word stories that people could read for the next week's class without any external context. So that's how I started working on the stories. Then when I graduated and I started working with my agent, that's when it was a decision to move it to a novel for multiple reasons. Of course, one being that novels are more popular. People read novels more than they read short stories. And I don't want to be at all critical of that because I read novels more than I read short stories. I really enjoy short stories. I appreciate them, but I read novels more. So that was, so I took a couple of years with my agent, who's a fantastic editor, and really I respect his feedback so much that I unraveled all the stories and turned it into a novel.
Well, and as a new writer, I think writing short fiction is a great way to start understanding storycraft. And Ray Bradbury, the famous science fiction author, was a huge proponent, and that was the one piece of writing advice he constantly gave to people: was write short stories, learn how to get from the beginning to the end, make a complete point. And do that over and over again, and then start expanding that out after you understand how a story works. And I still think that that's great advice for a writer. It doesn't mean don't write long fiction, but start by just understanding how the thing works.
Right, and it's difficult. Short stories are extremely difficult.
Extremely difficult, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So you worked on this for a couple of years. When you spend so much time with a project like this, how do you know that you're finished with it? That's one of the hardest things, is to, throw your hands up and say, okay, it's done, and, then send it off.
I know. And you never know, right? It's always terrifying.
Did there come a point where you were like, okay, I've spent all the time with these characters that I can spend. This is it.
I know, I'm still not there. I'm still having a hard time working on the next one because I miss them. I miss the characters in the Windfall. But I think it gets to a point, especially when you're working with people outside yourself. And thank God for this, because otherwise I would still be marinating with these characters. But it got to a point where my agent said, this is it. It wasn't me making that call. It was him. And I don't know if I don't know if I would have done it prematurely or if I would never have done it. I suspect I would never have done it because there was always more I wanted to do with them. And even now, I really have to consciously put them aside while I'm working on my next novel. But it was, and I'm grateful for this, it was my agent who had to finally say, it's done. And for me, it always feels like I abandoned them. I left these characters. I had so much more to do with them, so much more to do with the story. So it feels like a bit of a betrayal and an abandonment. But thanks to him, I was forced to rip the Band-Aid off and willingly say, yes, we're done. Send it out.
Do you think that you'll ever revisit these characters again?
So in a way, I sort of am, because it's been optioned for television. And I've been fairly involved with that process so far. So it's nice. It's comforting. I haven't had to fully let go of them. But at the same time, these specific characters, I probably will not return to in fiction, especially if the television show does end up happening and they take on a life of their own. I probably will have to fully let them go. But my next book is also based a little bit in this world of wealthy India.
Well, it's really the perfect situation that we live in now, where television is doing so much exceptional stuff now that characters can keep living and growing. And I didn't know that news. I'm really excited for you. That's awesome.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm very excited. Also quite nervous. It is odd to allow other people to take control of my characters, but it's quite exciting. I'm working with wonderful producers at Paramount at Anonymous Content who are really respecting my work and my writing and the original characters and original ideas behind this. So they've been so wonderful to work with that I'm learning to not be scared and just be excited.
Oh, that's so awesome. Such great news. Can you tell us anything about the new project that you're working on?
Just about what I just said. It's still quite early, but, similar. It's a bit more global. This novel is less based entirely in India. It is largely in Delhi, but there's also parts in New York and London and Sydney. So it does go all over the globe, but it's a similar world of the Indian elite and actually the global elite. It's interesting. I teach at a couple of summer programs, creative writing, and they're very expensive summer programs where we have high school students come in to study creative writing. And what's so interesting to me is that they all come from different parts of the world, but from a similar socioeconomic strata that gives them a similar language and similar reference points to each other, even though a couple of them have grown up in Singapore, some in Hong Kong, some in Bombay, some in New York, some in LA, some in Paris. They've grown up all over the world, but wealth gives them certain similarities and access to certain things that shrinks their world despite the obvious physical distances. And I find that so interesting. And that's a little bit of what I've been tapping into in this next book.
The Windfall is out now in hardback. It's also out today in paperback. Diksha, this book got a lot of media attention: Entertainment Weekly, Time Magazine, Rolling Stone, Esquire, People Magazine. A lot of people were talking about it. How did that make you feel as a new writer, who has lived through these characters, to know that it was so well received and that people really liked the work that you do?
Just absolutely overwhelmed. Like I said, when I wrote it for myself, and I was so scared about putting these characters who I love so deeply out into the world, because I was so scared they would be misunderstood or laughed at in a mean way that I never intended. I never wanted any cruelty on even my most unlikable characters. I love them all so deeply. And the readers have read it with such compassion and such understanding. And I've had people reach out to me with such warmth and love. And, I was actually so nervous about how it would be received that I had a baby a month before the book hit shelves. Not completely deliberately, but I did think through the timing. So in a way, I almost didn't have time to process the reaction to it. But it has been so overwhelmingly wonderful that it has given me the inspiration and the confidence to keep writing, which is the thing I'm most grateful for, that the readers have taken to it in a way that I want to keep doing this.
Well, you have a real talent for drawing characters and making us care about them. You said even the less likable characters, people really resonate with them, and I think that even though this book takes place in Delhi, and I've never been to Delhi, I know these characters. There are family members or members of my community or friends, that we all have that cousin that we've watched go through some stuff, and we're, just getting popcorn waiting to see how this turns out. and these characters are people that could walk into any of our lives at any moment. And so congratulations on making those so real and so connectable.
Oh, thank you so much. That really means a lot to me. That's exactly the response I was hoping for.
Absolutely. So we're going to encourage everyone to go pick up a copy of The Windfall. It's out in paperback today. It's also out in hardback if you want to get the collectible hardback edition. Diksha, where can people find you online if they want to follow along with your work and what's coming up next? And do you have a website or on social media?
Yeah, I do have a website. I believe it's authordikshabasu.com. I don't keep too much track of it, but there is a lot of my other writing, my personal essays are up there. I also do tweet and occasionally Instagram. So those are also good ways to keep up with me. I'm very easy to find. I don't think there's anyone else with my name out there. So especially Twitter is where I'm the most active.
Excellent. We'll put links to all of it in the show notes. Diksha, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Hank, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
The brutes of the Andersonville Prison Hospital have moved me to the dead room, or so it has come to be known. None so domiciled have yet left this place. We receive only the smallest rations and only cursory care, to reduce our odors and spare the nostrils of our keepers. The good Christians of the Confederacy do not see any need to provide comfort to those who will soon sleep soundly enough underground. You must know, at least, how your father came to such an end. At Doctortown, Kilpatrick entrusted me with the conquest of a railroad trestle, and my bummers, my demolition team, acquitted themselves admirably, thanks to my ingenuity with powder. We successfully destroyed the trestle work past Morgan's Lake. This would prove to be my entire contribution to the war. Federal troops were unable to capture the bridge or overcome the enemy's battery. Kilpatrick withdrew, and my bummers and I found ourselves on the wrong side of the Altamaha River. behind the enemy line with no hope of reaching our encampment. Rebels accosted us, taking our remaining supplies. We escaped and headed south, hoping by a long march to reach Seymour's forces in Jacksonville, but we encountered other rebel encampments at Jessup. 4 of my men were lost to gunfire. We marched west, then south again, barely evading capture. We had no choice but to brave the great swamp Okefenokee. Oh, on and on it goes, in every direction, endlessly. We trudged through miles of grasping mud and noxious rot, pursued by hunger and the mosquito, scratching at our arms and faces until all our skin was scourged. We lived off alligator meat at first, then nothing at all. My men grew mutinous, blamed me for all their misfortunes, threatened to throw me in a sack, weigh me down with stones, and sink my body. Yet was I not equally hungry? Did I not starve? I grew weary of their endless insubordination and contempt. Finally, they took hold of me and swore they would hang me by the neck for leading them to ruin. They were 5 in number, younger than I and more muscular. I was no match for them physically. They laid their hands on me, and I burned them. I burned those men. The flame rose from me as from a volcano, stripping the skin from those boys, blackening their faces, roasting their flesh. And let this be my final ghastly confession. I feasted that night, feasted on the meat of my prospective murderers. And that is how I survived. I staggered alone from that swamp, a mad thing, fueled by outrage and guilt. I saw an encampment of rebel soldiers and surrendered myself gladly. They say in Andersonville prison all men are brothers, equal in filth, equal in terror, equal in ruin. Yet I feel I may claim some small distinction, at least. For I am surely damned to a greater extent than any here.